Hello, I'm Gene Sinclair, 2005 ASA President at ASA headquarters in the Wood Library Museum to record an interview for the John Pender Living History of Anesthesiology series with 2002 ASA President Barry Glazer of Indianapolis, Indiana on Wednesday, August 15th, 2012. Barry, welcome.
Thank you, Gene.
I'm sure I speak for the Wood Library Museum trustees when I thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to record this interview today. I know that it will be a very interesting and valuable resource for the members of our society. I will be asking you questions about your early life, your education, and your career, but please do not feel limited to answering only the questions that I ask. If other thoughts come to your mind, just go with them and tell us what you wish. First, I would ask you to tell us a little bit about your early life. Were either of your parents physicians or otherwise involved in healthcare?
That's an interesting question, Gene, and the answer is no, not at all. My father did not quite finish high school. They both grew up during the Depression, and my father had to take a job before he was able to finish high school, and my mother was only a high school graduate. But they both did contribute to my early life, obviously, each with their own individual contribution. My father was in retail sales almost all his life, and from him I learned a work ethic. I remember very well an episode once. We did not have a car when I was young, where he needed to catch a bus to get to work, and the buses were down, and he was very upset about the fact that he might be late to work. So from my father I learned a work ethic that was very, very substantially impressed on me. And my mother, as was the case back then for most mothers, was a stay-at-home mom, and took me to the library once a week, which was a tremendous contribution to my love of learning and my ability to read, which led to my success in school. So her contribution was to instill in me the value of reading and of education.
Well, they certainly gave you a good start in life. Have you always lived in Indiana?
Almost all my life was spent in Indiana. I went to elementary and high school in the public school systems in Indianapolis, Indiana. Went to college in Bloomington, Indiana for my undergraduate education. Back to Indianapolis to the Indiana University School of Medicine for medical school and residency. So all my early years were there, and then after my stint in the Army, I was back in Indiana again.
Was medicine your only career consideration?
Actually, medicine was kind of something I backed into, unlike a lot of people who know from the time they're young that they want to be a physician. I started out in college as a math major, and when I didn't have the success I felt I ought to have with that early on, I switched to a sociology major and then to a psychology major to be a psychiatrist. And someone told me, hey, if you want to be a psychiatrist, you have to be a physician. And although I was anxious about the chemistry, I took the pre-medical courses and went off to medical school, initially with the intention of becoming a psychiatrist.
Well, it's certainly been beneficial to your patients that you changed career paths. You mentioned that you had served in the armed forces. Where did you serve, and what were your assignments?
I was at Fort Meade, Maryland. I was one of the last of the Berry planners. The Berry Plan was a program where the Army would allow you to finish your residency, in exchange for which you would agree to go in after you completed your residency, in exchange for which they would agree to use you in your specialty if they had an opening for your specialty. And since I really didn't enjoy the rest of medicine nearly as much as I enjoyed anesthesiology, that seemed like a great opportunity for me. I was in medical school during Vietnam, and deferring my service until Vietnam was wrapping up turned out to be a very fortunate opportunity for me. When I went in as a Berry planner, I was stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland, and Fort Meade was a small hospital, very like a community hospital. There was myself as chief of anesthesiology and 5 nurse anesthetists running a 4 operating room suite, and it was very much the patient population and age range that you would see in a small community hospital.
Well, that's certainly interesting information to have for this interview. There are other questions I'd like to ask you, though. You mentioned your transition from one career path that you thought you would seek to ending up in anesthesia. Who were the people, and what other influences would you say account for ultimately selecting anesthesiology?
I can remember very well when we started out as freshmen in medical school, being pretty much overwhelmed by the volume of information there was to learn about all the different specialties and all the different sciences. But during our pharmacology lectures, we had 2 weeks of anesthesiology lectures by a gentleman who had a joint appointment in the Department of Pharmacology and the Department of Anesthesiology. And it seemed to me at the time that anesthesiology was much more discrete, and that I might be able to feel like I knew enough about it when I was done studying it. So that was one of the reasons that I chose anesthesiology early on. As I went through medical school, I stayed interested, and between my junior and senior year, at that time the ASA was sponsoring preceptorships in anesthesiology, and I had the opportunity to actually work in the anesthesiology department as an extern during the summer between my junior and senior years, and that reinforced my interest in the specialty. Everything I saw in the operating room and in critical care was very interesting to me and stimulating, and it looked like a life and a career that I would enjoy.
Very interesting. Once you were established in the practice, who and what factors influenced the ultimate choice of the career path that you embarked on?
I knew during residency that I did not enjoy sharing cases, and obviously during residency, when you're starting out, you have a senior resident working with you, and then as you become the senior resident, you have junior residents working with you, and I really didn't enjoy sharing my cases, so I knew that I probably would not end up in academic anesthesiology and probably would not end up in a care team mode. So my experience in residency made it quite clear to me that I was probably going to choose, and I did ultimately choose, a practice with one-on-one physician anesthesia.
During your early years in anesthesiology, are you able to identify a single or maybe a small number of people who had the primary influence on your ultimate career path?
When I was wrapping up in the Army, it was one of those periods of time that we have every 15 or 20 years in anesthesiology where there is a shortage of positions available. But I had met a few of the physicians down in Vincennes, Indiana, where I had moonlighted for a couple of weeks during residency when they were short of help. And Dick Stein, who was the chairman of the group down there, gave me a call and said, "We have a position and we'd be happy to have you join us." So it was Dick that got me into my first private practice down in Vincennes, Indiana. A few years later, some of the physicians with whom I was in residency said that they had openings back in Indianapolis, Indiana, in their practice, and I was eager to get back to Indianapolis. That was my hometown, and I'm kind of a city boy. And although the physicians and the practice were excellent in Vincennes, it was time for me to get back to a city environment. And so Nayland Shaw was one of my co-residents who offered me a position with him at St. Francis Hospital in Indianapolis, and that guided me back to Indianapolis.
Was it only geography that influenced your transition from Vincennes to Indianapolis?
It It was also the opportunity to do more challenging cases. In Vincennes, we didn't do any open heart, we didn't do any neurosurgery, and I really knew that if I did not get those back into my practice at some point early in my career, that I would have those options probably no longer available to me later in my career. So it was the more expansive practice as well as the geography.
Were there other sites other than the military, Vincennes and Indianapolis, where you practiced?
No, those were the only places that I practiced during my career.
What were some of the accomplishments in your career that have given you the most satisfaction personally?
My involvement with the American Society of Anesthesiologists is by far the most satisfying part of my career, even though it doesn't deal directly with my personal practice of anesthesiology. I always found my involvement with the ASA to be some of the most rewarding time I spent. I enjoyed the practice time, but being in a private practice, and usually in a smaller private practice, I really never had the opportunity to make an impact on the specialty other than through my involvement with the ASA.
Was there one type of clinical practice that you found more personally rewarding? Cardiac, pediatric, obstetric?
I actually enjoyed all the different aspects. I had a more extensive exposure to pediatric anesthesia than most people in residency, and so I always felt more comfortable than a lot of my colleagues did with pediatric cases. And I also always enjoyed using the newer agents. When I was in residency, I selected Indiana University among two places that still used a wide variety of agents. When I interviewed for anesthesiology residencies, I went to a lot of places where the agents and the clinical techniques were very limited, and I wanted to train somewhere where the variety of clinical opportunities and agents used were very wide. And that gave me a great deal of comfort when it came time to use new agents in practice. And so I was usually the first one in my group to use a new agent when it came on the market, and that was always fun for me.
The innovator of the group. In the course of your career, since it has been extensive both clinically and in organized medicine, you've undoubtedly met a large number of colleagues, professionals, anesthesiologists. Who are the people with whom you've associated that you admired most, and why?
Well, in Indiana, in my practice, I had the opportunity in my first years to work with Dick Stein, who I mentioned earlier, as inviting me to join his group. Dick was on the board of directors of ASA when I came to Vincennes, Indiana, and was responsible for my earliest involvement with ASA. When I was in residency, Bill Matthews and Virgil K. Stolting, were two of the staff members that were most influential on me. And then shortly after I finished my residency, VK's son, Bob Stolting, took over the chairmanship of the department. And I felt like Bob was also very influential because he represented such a broad area of interest. Bob was not only involved in organized anesthesiology, but was an outstanding leader in academic anesthesiology as well.
You've certainly named some very prominent people in the history of our profession that have influenced you and many others, but I'm sure they would count you as among their more prominent protégés. What are the activities and accomplishments in the professional organizations such as ASA that come to mind as you look back on your career?
I remember Dick asking me if I'd like to be, first of all, on a committee of ASA, and I said yes. And the primary reason at that time is I thought it would be great fun to have the opportunity to go to Chicago for a weekend once in a while for a meeting. But once I got involved in the work, I really enjoyed the work as well. And when Dick saw that, he asked me if I'd like to be an alternate delegate when Indiana qualified for an additional delegate position. Through that, I had the opportunity to move into the delegate's position when one opened up later on. And from there, as they say, the rest is history. Attending the House of Delegates was great fun for me. It was the first time I had seen a large meeting conducted under formal parliamentary procedure for a long time. And I remember the speaker's booming voice running the meeting at that time, and I was most impressed, and I think I was destined to stay involved in the House. So I did my committee work. I got a chairmanship and started talking to the district director, who by that time was Woody Stogsdill, Dick's successor, during the House meetings, and I would say, the speaker could have handled that a little differently, or the speaker should have explained this or that. And one day Woody looked at me and said, maybe you ought to run for speaker someday. Well, at that time, I really didn't consider it very seriously, but as time went on, I did have the opportunity to go ahead and do that and move through the offices in ASA. I also had some opportunity to be involved a little bit in the County Medical Society and the State Medical Association, but not nearly to the extent that I was involved with the ASA.
I'd like later to come back to some of your activities as a speaker.
Certainly.
And the associated activities, but you mentioned committee appointments. As I recall, you did have a committee chairmanship, the Committee on Communications. Do you have any memories of that you'd like to mention at this time?
When I became the Communications Committee chair, the first thought that went through my mind is this is much like being the vice president of advertising. And there was a movie not too long before that called How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. And Robert Morris was the star who was rising up through the business. And when he got to be vice president of advertising, he said, "You're on your way up now that you're a vice president, unless you're vice president of advertising." And the communications chairmanship seemed very much like that to me. Some of the communications committee chairs before me had moved on to greater things, and some had found that chairmanship to be the end of their anesthesiology career. And so I took that to heart. And immediately when I became the communications chair, I did a survey of the board of directors to find out what the board of directors thought were the activities that the committee was doing that were worthwhile, and what the activities were that they felt the committee could discontinue. And so I started out in that chairmanship listening to what others had to say as to what directions the committee chairmanship and the committee should go in. And I think that was very helpful to me in deciding what activities the committee should concentrate on. But I did have one pet project in the Communications Committee, and that was the leadership spokesperson training. I had had the opportunity to participate in that, and it had been discontinued. And during my chairmanship, I got that reintroduced for the rank and file. It had been continued for the top officers, but I got it reintroduced for the rank and file, and we continue to do some variation of that to this day.
That was certainly a valuable contribution to ASA with that leadership spokesperson initiative. Can you think of any other contributions you made to either ASA or the other medical associations, your county and state medical societies, that you would look back on as having been of particular value?
I think I'm most aware of my contributions as Vice Speaker and Speaker of the House of Delegates. As Vice Speaker, I instituted the orientation programs for the tellers, and for the reference committee chairs, got it more formally organized and more detailed, and built on what others had done before me in that area. And I think prior, I had often seen the Speaker of the House of Delegates, when it was time to take a counted vote, announce, "Will the tellers please attend?" And I watched the tellers scramble around trying to figure out just exactly what they were supposed to do now, because they'd never had any training. So I started a training program for the tellers so that they knew exactly what they were supposed to do when it was time for a counted vote, and also over time got them involved in other aspects of preparing the House, such as checking the microphones and the seating to make sure that everything was ready to go. As you're well aware, preparation is very important for a large meeting like the House of Delegates, and I tried to do as much of that preparation work as I could and get other people prepared as well.
That's very interesting. I'm trying to remember, Barry, but was it your initiative that began the meeting in the Speaker's office the night before the second session of the House of Delegates, in which members of the House could walk in and ask for mentoring or guidance on how to introduce the business they had under consideration?
Yes, that happened on our shift together as Speaker and Vice Speaker. As I recall, We called it Speaker's Office Hours, and it was held the night before the last session of the House. Frequently, by that point in time, people knew if they wanted to introduce motions or try to accomplish something on the floor of the House the next morning, and we would ask them to come to that Speaker's Office Hours and discuss with us what they wanted to do. Allegedly, our purpose was to help them say the right thing at the right time, to help them word their motions and choreograph any support that they needed to be successful. But it also let us, as the presiding officers, know what was coming so that we could look very slick as these things happen apparently from the floor spontaneously, but we knew exactly where everything was going to go, which microphone to recognize, and who was going to come up to the mic next. So it worked for everyone and made the meeting run smoother for everybody.
I think that was the principal goal, and of course there were those that conducted business that did not come to the Speaker's office hours. There was one big issue that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. Going back to 2001, during your predecessor's term in office, there was a change in Medicare conditions of participation that allowed states, under certain circumstances, to opt out of the requirement for physician participation in anesthesia care for patients. And the first year in which ASA had to live with that new Medicare rule was during your term in office. And I'd be interested to learn, and I'm sure our members would too, what sort of considerations that raised for you and your fellow officers in dealing with that new environment.
Thank you. By way of background, the conditions of participation are rules that Medicare has that govern payment of hospitals. And one of those rules at that time stated that in order for a hospital to receive payment from Medicare, any anesthetic that was administered to a Medicare patient had to be supervised by a physician, if not directly provided by a physician. So it was basically a payment rule that forced hospitals to require physician supervision of nurse anesthetists, at least for their Medicare patients. Under the Clinton administration, it was proposed that that rule be dropped. And through a long period of lobbying, both by the entire society, a lot of legislative activity, and a lot of personal activity on behalf of my predecessor, Neil Swissman, we were able to persuade the Bush administration, when they came into office, to moderate that proposed rule to some extent by saying that the rule would stay in place, but that any state could opt out of the rule. And the conditions for opting out were that it was done by the governor, and that the governor must consult with the Board of Medicine and Board of Nursing in their state, that the governor must testify or attest to the fact that it was consistent with state law and in the best interest of the citizens of that state, and that it be consistent with the state law in the state where the opt-out was being proposed. And if the governor met those three conditions, they could write to the CMS, to Medicare, and say we want to opt out, and it was done. It was a unilateral activity on the part of the governor. Well, anesthesiologists were very accustomed to lobbying for all kinds of legislative initiatives and regulatory initiatives at the federal level and at the state level, but it had very little interaction with the governor, and suddenly the governor became a critical component of our lobbying activities. Many of us were caught off guard. For one thing, we learned that while the governor must consult with the medical board and the nursing board, the two licensing boards, they didn't have to listen to them. So even in states where we had a medical licensing board that unanimously and vigorously opposed an opt-out, the governor could still go ahead and opt out. So what we learned, and there were 5 states that opted out during that first year under my administration, what we learned mostly was that it was a really big challenge, that we had to develop relationships with the medical licensing board that we had never had to develop before, and that we had to develop relationships with the governor. And much of my year was spent helping the states that were facing opt-outs through that process, and also trying to educate the other states about the relationships with the governor that they needed to develop to protect them in the future. And to this day, some states have been very successful in learning that lesson, and some states have been less successful.
That's very helpful information. Earlier I alluded to the fact that I would like to come back to some of your activities surrounding your service as ASA speaker. To frame this question, I think you know, and most of the members of the House of Delegates know, that people who serve as ASA speaker and vice speaker usually undertake some formal education in parliamentary procedure in order to improve their parliamentary or their presiding skills. And when they've completed their term of service, that's the end of the line. They usually don't pursue it. In your case, you have continued to work very actively in the field of parliamentary procedure to the point where today you're one of the best known and most accomplished parliamentarians in the country, and you've done a lot in that field since you've left your service with ASA. And I would like you to spend some time helping us learn about the motivation and the interests that led you to do this, and even talk about some of your achievements in that area.
Thank you. It has become something that's grown from an interesting hobby into a retirement profession. My initial foray into parliamentary education was when I was first elected vice speaker. I had seen a former vice speaker stumble during one of their presiding sessions and fail to be reelected later on, and I did not want that to happen to me, so I wanted to get an opportunity to learn more about parliamentary procedure and practice presiding outside of the House of Delegates. So I got involved with the American Institute of Parliamentarians and some of their educational activities. They had programs called practicums, which to me meant that I would have an opportunity to practice my presiding skills, and to some extent that was true, and to some extent it was mostly education in other areas unrelated to presiding as well. But I took it to heart, and every time I attended a practicum, I filled out an evaluation saying, "More presiding practice, please." And over time, that did grow into a larger and larger activity. Of course, I had an extensive period of time as vice speaker and speaker, and I feel like I did improve my skills with practice there in the House of Delegates as well. But at the same time, in parallel, I was getting more involved with the American Institute of Parliamentarians. The practicums that I attended first invited me to give a cameo talk and then a full lecture, and eventually I became faculty at the practicums, and then chairman of some of the practicums, and general chairman for the practicum, and also got involved with their board of directors. I was put on the authorship team or the revision team for the 4th edition of the Standard Code of Parliamentary Procedure, commonly known as Sturgis, which is the parliamentary authority used instead of Robert's Rules of Order by most medical and dental organizations. So with my background in ASA as speaker and vice speaker, and also my background in the parliamentary organization and my experience teaching parliamentary procedure there, I had, and also my authorship of the 4th edition of the Standard Code, I had a unique collection of credentials to do what I would have liked to have had available to me, which is to start to put on advanced presiding workshops for people who were starting out in positions like speaker and vice speaker. And so when I retired early from anesthesiology in order to do those workshops, that's exactly what I did. I prepared a in-depth presiding workshop with a target audience of speakers and vice speakers, or people aspiring to be speaker or vice speaker, mostly of state medical and dental associations, but also of their national specialty societies as well. And it turned out to be a very rewarding experience for me. Interestingly, as an adjunct to that, I also got the opportunity to start doing some work as a convention parliamentarian, and I've had the opportunity to do that with medical and dental societies, but also with a wide variety of other organizations, international service organizations, large unions, and a variety of other organizations, which has been fascinating to me to see how each of them does their business. And it's been a great retirement activity for me, and has become a retirement profession that I enjoy, particularly at this point in time when we've just completed in the American Institute of Parliamentarians a new book on parliamentary procedure called the American Institute of Parliamentarians Standard Code of Parliamentary Procedure, which was just released a few months ago, and which I was also on the authorship team for. So hopefully I continue to hold some credentials in that area, and will be able to continue to be of value to people in teaching them how to preside over House of Delegates with formal parliamentary procedure, but also to know a lot of other presiding tricks that I learned from my own experience, from other parliamentarians, and from serving a variety of organizations, so that I can share with them more than just what the books have to offer.
That's good information for many of our members to know, and probably will explain for them why the conduct of business at their medical associations is much better than it has been in the past. Barry, for most ASA officers, particularly the presidents, they had families in the background during the time they served and could not have done the job they did had it not been for the support and encouragement of their families. Can you tell us anything about your family situation?
Sure, you're absolutely right. Of course, it would be very, very, very difficult to be involved in ASA at the top levels without the strong support of your spouse. I had the good fortune to be married to my wife Jan now for almost 41 years, and she was fully supportive throughout, but she made a particular sacrifice that most spouses don't have to make. In my early years as an officer, she stayed at home when I went to ASA meetings because, first of all, I was working the entire time as vice speaker and speaker. You're probably the busiest officer at the ASA meeting, and our daughter was still in high school, and she felt like her place was at home. But once our daughter graduated and was off to college, she would come to the meetings. But in either case, her birthday was October 21st, and our anniversary was October 17th. So there was hardly an ASA meeting scheduled during the entire 20 or 25 years that I was a delegate and an officer that we didn't have to celebrate either her birthday or our anniversary at some ASA event. And sometimes that was great fun. We were in some nice place. And other times we were at some foundation dinner that I didn't mind being at, but was probably not the way she would have liked to have spent our anniversary. So she made some tremendous sacrifices during those years in sharing our anniversary and her birthday with others that were not as close to us as the people we might have liked to have celebrated with. And she was always there for me. She knew best all my weaknesses, as spouses do, and yet she was always great about telling everybody else how great I was, in spite of the fact that she knew better.
How about your daughter? You mentioned she was in high school when Jan was staying at home through the meetings. Where is she now?
She is, of course, graduated high school and college, spent some time in Washington, D.C. doing some service work, and then moved to Boston, where she spent 7 or 8 years teaching English as a second language, which she has found to be a very rewarding career and one for which she's very well suited. She has just very recently moved from Boston to California, where she's hoping to do some graduate work in that area and get a master's degree, and also where her fiancé lives. She's just recently gotten engaged, so we're very pleased with the very important changes occurring in her life as well, and still enjoy her company as much as we ever did.
Barry, other than medicine and parliamentary science, do you have any hobbies that you use for passing your spare time, or that just to decompress?
I enjoy playing poker, and I do that on a fairly regular basis. Since I've always played poker since I was in high school a little bit, but I've never been very good at it. And although I'm a lot better now, I'm still not very good at it, but it's a nice pastime. I have a regular Tuesday game that with a group of friends that is more social than anything else. But that's probably my main hobby, other than the parliamentary procedure, and certainly not as good a source of income as the parliamentary procedure has been.
Well, if I were to start watching these cable channels for the poker tournaments, would I see you on any of them?
You most definitely would not see me on any of those. I do like to play tournament poker, and I have cashed in a few tournaments, but at a much lower level than the ones you see on television. But it is a fun activity.
There have been quite a number of changes in anesthesiology practice in the last several decades in which you've been involved, both in the science and in the business aspects of it, the socioeconomic. How do you view these changes, and where do you think they're all headed?
Well, in terms of the science of anesthesiology, I always found it interesting to observe when I was wrapping up my practice that almost all of the medications, the drugs that we used when I started out in my career, were no longer in use. About the only two drugs that were still in use on a regular basis were succinylcholine, and that not too much, oxygen and nitrous oxide, that were around when I started. Everything had changed substantially over my career, both in terms of intravenous and inhalation agents, and so that was interesting. Of course, the monitoring technology went from a very hands-on, manual sort of thing to a very automated sort of approach to monitoring as well. So there have been huge changes in anesthesiology, even during the brief 25 or 30 years that I was in practice, in terms of the science of the practice. In terms of the politics and economics of anesthesiology, it was interesting to me when I first got involved as speaker and vice speaker to go back and read some of the minutes of the very early House of Delegates meetings, and I learned that the issues that we were concerned with were issues that had been around for a long, long time. Scope of practice, the public image of our specialty, and the economics of the specialty. And those were around 40 years before I was speaker and vice speaker, and they are still around. And so I think based on that long history, we have good reason to expect that those issues will still be important. I think that scope of practice will probably be a challenge for not only anesthesiology, but all of medicine, as we find more and more people looking for physician services, and a continuing and increasing physician shortage, especially in the specialties. We'll probably see more and more of medicine delegated to non-physician extenders of medical care. My biggest concern, both as a physician and as a patient in the future, is to what extent those physician extenders will be physician extenders as opposed to physician replacements. I think that it's great to have people help the physician with all kinds of medical care, but I think it's critically important to have good care, that the physician remain involved in all aspects of patient care.
Those are very perceptive comments. I would ask if you would dwell just for a minute on one thing you mentioned about the transitioning from a very hands-on monitoring style earlier in your career to more use of monitors later on. Do you view that change from a very intense hands-on monitoring technique to the technical monitors, the electronic monitors, as a positive change or indifferent?
As with all change, it has its advantages and its disadvantages. Certainly there's a great deal more information available to the physician now in taking care of their patient in anesthesiology, and I think we're all able to make better decisions with more data. To some extent, the monitors have sometimes distracted the physician from paying direct attention to the patient and to the surgery that's going on, which I think is an important skill as well. And I think people in our area that transitioned through both of those had the benefit of being able to combine the two, where I'm not sure that everyone that comes out of anesthesiology residency today has had as much opportunity to do the hands-on without the distraction of the monitoring, so that they can combine the two skills.
That's a very good observation. I'm sure it'll be noted by the many observers of this recorded interview. I have no further questions. Is there anything else that you would like to discuss?
I don't believe so, Gene. I think we've hit some of the high points of important things that happened in the specialty during my time as ASA president and during my time in practice, and I hope that the viewers of this interview will find some of that of some historical interest, as well as I'm sure you've given them a great opportunity to get to know me a little better as well, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
I thank you, Barry. You've been very informative, and I know this recording will be a very valuable resource for our members and for the Wood Library Museum. I would like to thank them, the Wood Library Museum, and the committee on the John Pender Living History series, for allowing us to conduct this interview today.